Hey guys, it's Josie with Queen My Pawn. So there's going to be two parts that I'm going to be discussing. The actual building and why you need those parts. And I know I said two parts, but actually there's three parts. We're going to go over the testing afterwards. Okay, I chose my components based on Newegg's Build a PC module. The module helped me choose compatible parts, as otherwise I could have chosen a motherboard, for example, one of the parts that didn't fit another part, like my CPU. When using this module, choose a CPU and the motherboard's automatically narrowed down to something that fits with it. You can also do it the other way around, where you could choose a motherboard and the CPUs have to be compatible with it. So in other words, this is a good idea to use. Always use PC builders. Now I want to talk about the motherboard. When you send a text to your friend on a phone, that information passes to a cell phone tower before it gets to their phone. It's like, here's your message, then it goes to the cell phone tower, then it goes to their phone. Motherboards are like those cell phone towers in the middle. They're like the middleman. For example, the CPU processes information. It passes it onto the GPU, but the GPU and the CPU are connected through the motherboard. The CPU, which is you, could be connected to the GPU, your friend, through the motherboard. You send the text and it gets to the other side. Then the GPU would illustrate this image onto a monitor connected by a cable. We can see what the computer has rendered or imagined on the screen, which is why you're seeing me right now. Now, that couldn't have been done without the motherboard. Let's talk about the CPU. The CPU processes input. So you put in some information and it'll think about it. Then it's gonna give you a result like, oh, here's what I thought about what you put in. For example, you put some stuff into the notepad with your keyboard. Now your keyboard isn't automatically just a G, it's gonna be like bits and bytes. And that goes into the CPU, and the CPU then sends that information to the GPU, which displays G. That's really easy for the CPU to do. But when the CPU wants to run different stuff at the same time, like Google Chrome and chess space or other heavy duty apps like even gaming, it can be difficult. You got a stack of history papers and a stack of math papers to complete. You got chess space right here, you got Google Chrome right here. How do you run those things at the same time? That's when you gotta invite your friend over to help. A friend has a brain, and two brains working together can complete more than just one, because one can handle history and the other can handle math. The people working together are core to the process, and that's what's meant when a CPU has dual cores or quad cores. It's got two brains or four brains. The more the better. In fact, my Ryzen, when I'm going to talk about it in a little bit, it has 6 cores, and it's got 12 threads. So threads are another thing. Having 2 threads instead of 1 is like working on 2 history papers at the same time. So it's like I'm doing both papers at the same time. Obviously that can't be done without losing efficiency, but computers can actually do that. So images could be sent to the GPU in less than half of the time. Then there's finally a clock speed. So clock speed is how fast it can think. So if you got one brain and one thread, it's how fast it can work using just that. If you have a fast clock speed, it's like being a genius. But if you only got one core and one thread, you're gonna be really slow when another thing pops into your environment. Like, oh my gosh, now I gotta take out the trash. Oh my gosh, what can I do? Oh my gosh, I gotta do this first. So with having 2 cores, you could easily take out the trash, even if you go down in clock speed. So that's the thing. You can have more clock speed and less cores, or you can have more cores and less clock speed, or you could just have both, which is what I was opting for. With 3.6 gigahertz of clock speed, you have more than enough to even game. Just to put things in perspective, the highest production clock speed right now, the core with the highest production clock speed means that it's out there in the consumer world. It's 5.7 gigahertz by IBM, and that's for like business people that need to run like business stuff. Then you have the world record, which is like 8.7, and that's overclocked, which means that they basically revved it up to the highest potential. That's another story for another day. I want to talk about something that most consumers miss. My Samsung Notebook 9 Pro has a 7th generation Intel i7 processor. Of course, everyone's heard of Intel. But this only has 2 cores, 4 threads, and a clock speed of 2.7 gigahertz. Intel recommends they sell this for $400, just the core itself, the CPU. But my Ryzen cost only $200, and it's way better. Why? Well, Intel has a long history of the chip's architecture that we use today, which is x86. You've probably heard of that. When you use Windows, you got x64 or x86, thanks to Intel. All the computer brands know them. They always ask Intel for the chips. But why did even AMD come into the game? Well, IBM in the 1980s wanted to partner with Intel, but they needed a second supplier because they didn't want to depend on just Intel. So Intel hired AMD to be their second supplier. Eventually, they split apart, and AMD, in the process before that, was able to see what they were doing with their chips, the x86 chips, so they built their own. So that's cool. But thanks to Intel's reputation, they're able to charge more. So that's why Intel is so well known and so expensive, but AMD is better for the builder. But for example, like my Samsung, I bought it for $1,000, and maybe I didn't have to do that because, like, even though i7 is a great chip, it's not the best chip. But my computer is good, you know, for practical purposes, so that's why I probably feel like I had a good time spending $1,000. Anyways, at least they can both run Windows 10. So for Windows 10, you need 1 gigahertz of clock speed, which is more than enough with the Ryzen or even an Intel i7 or i5. And yeah, it's good enough. Now let's talk about the GPU. I decided on a GeForce GT 1030, and this is basically good enough for a beginner. It's also required to run with the Ryzen because the Ryzen doesn't have an integrated GPU like Intel does. Integrated GPUs come with the CPU, they're ingrained in it, but they might not be as good as a dedicated GPU. This GPU is dedicated just to running graphics. It means it'll display graphics on your computer, it'll actually show stuff on your monitor. Without this, you're just gonna see a black screen. So, my GPU has a PCIe interface, which means that it's the modern interface on the motherboard, which in other words means that it's up to date and it's the fastest way to communicate with everything else. The GPU communicates with everything else the fastest way because of this. So, my GeForce also has 2 gigabytes of RAM, which is good enough because most of the time I only see like applications or anything else running on 300 megabytes of RAM when it comes to displaying graphics. So 2 gigabytes is more than enough for the beginner. I've also future-proofed myself in case I want to get more memory by having PCIe on my motherboard. Now let's talk about the system memory. So we basically have two things. We have short-term memory, which is what this stick of RAM does. Then we got long-term memory, which is what this SSD does. And short-term memory, you want to have, what's recommended is 16 gigabytes to 6 of 8, because remember, you need 2 friends to do twice the work in the same amount of time. SSD, I got 500 gigs, which is more than enough. I haven't even used up all of my 256 gigs on my laptop, and I thought I needed a 512. That's not. This is also a M.2, which is the most up-to-date version. It can transfer stuff very fast, unlike a HDD, which is mechanical, and because it's mechanical, it's got to move its mechanical arm around to transfer data really slowly. By the way, I almost forgot that you obviously need a case to build all of your equipment on. So I'm gonna basically show you what my case is. I got the Fractal Meshify C, and here it is. It's pretty big. This is the back, but why I chose it is because of the front. You can see everything that's inside, and that's why the power supply that I got, the RGB, is gonna be beautiful when I turn this baby on. And I just see so many ways that the heat could escape from this thing, so it's awesome. I'm looking forward to building this computer. Lastly, before I forget, another reason why I got the Meshify C, the Fractal, is because of its form factor, which is micro ATX. There are 3 types of form factors: mini ITX, micro ATX, and ATX. So it'll be compatible with your motherboard. So let's say you got a motherboard of micro ATX, which is what I got. It says it in the back right here, micro ATX. I need to get a case that's also micro ATX, or else the motherboard is not going to fit. So that's why you need to use a PC builder on Newegg. It's going to be able to narrow down your choices. Alright, let's get started. Here we go.